Hi, Misha here. And now that we've talked about a couple of the large fleet carriers of the Imperial Navy, and we've talked about the first carrier, Shoho, now let's talk about three so-called light carriers. These carriers were between 630 and 680 foot long and carried around 30 aircraft maximum, had a speed of between 28 and 29 knots, and all three here were actually conversions, originally built as submarine tenders or seaplane tenders. And we actually have two different classes. We have the Zuiho class. We have two members of it, Zuiho herself and Shoho. And we have the Chitose or Chitose class, and this is Chitose herself here. Very similar in a lot of ways, and a very interesting story. Actually, all of these were laid down in 1934 and 1935 and built in such a way that they could be easily converted to aircraft carriers, but were not originally built as carriers, partially because of the Washington Naval Treaty, the tonnage limits per class, and all that other stuff to do with the London Naval Treaty. You know, the whole treaty systems that Japan was still trying to nominally take part in at this point. And with that, let's begin with the carrier that actually was the first Japanese carrier to be lost in World War II, the Shoho. The light carrier Shoho, considered part of the Zuiho class. She was laid down towards the end of 1934, nominally as a submarine tender, submarine support ship. This, like I said, to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty. But they designed her in a way where she could either be used as a submarine tender, or turned into an oil tanker, or converted into an aircraft carrier. So with that, she was launched the following year, in 1935, and outfitting was slow as they kind of decided what to do with her. She was completed, officially commissioned in 1939, and then in 1940 it was decided to turn her into a light aircraft carrier, and work would begin 1941, wrapping up at the beginning of 1942 in January. She, after her refit into a light carrier, was about 674 feet long. She was just under 60 foot wide. She weighed in at about 11,500 tons light and about 13,500 tons fully laden up. She had, of course, your usual air defenses. She had a flight deck that was just a little over 590 feet long. And she had one main hangar that was about 407 foot long and just under 59 foot wide, so pretty much the entire hull. She had two elevators, front and rear, and she had no catapults. She had a top speed originally as a submarine tender of 29 knots, but when refitted to be an aircraft carrier, that dropped to 28 knots. And as a carrier, her crew was about 785. And she carried up to 30 aircraft. And she could carry the modern, like A6Ms and B5Ns and stuff. Now, her first mission was at the beginning of February, and she basically operated as a ferry. She took aircraft to the port of Truk, and she pretty much hung out there until April of 1942 when she was ordered back to Japan, at which time she received her first assignment. She would take part in what would become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. She would join up as part of the main task force with 4 heavy cruisers, and the strike part of this mission would be 2 fleet carriers that would operate separately. Now, there was an aircraft shortage at this point, so even though she could carry 30 modern aircraft, she actually, at this time when she left Japan at the end of April, had only 6 B-5N Kate bombers, 8 A-6M0 fighters, and 4 old A-5M Claudes. So, yeah, not a full air group by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, she departed, and first she covered some landings on May 3rd successfully, and then headed north to support the main invasion force, the main strike force. On May 5th, elements of the U.S. Army Air Corps would spot her and let the Navy know, but their carriers, which were Lexington and Yorktown in the area, were out of range. But it wouldn't take long. On May 7, she would engage, and that would pretty much be it. That would be her only battle. And it went about like most carriers did for Japan in World War II. She would meet up with airplanes from the USS Lexington, and her air patrol was pretty light. She had 2 A-5Ms and 1 A-6-0 up at the time. So when the first wave of SBDs came in, they pretty well were unopposed. But this was a little after 11 a.m. on the 7th. The first wave basically missed. They did very little damage. So she put up another 3 A-6Ms, reinforcing the cap. And just under 10 minutes later, the second wave of SBDs would come. And this time, they would be rather effective. They would have direct hits with 2 1,000-pound bombs that would do the thing that happens to most Japanese carriers. They would punch through the flight deck, land on the hangar bay, explode on the hangar bay, igniting fuel, ammunition, aircraft, and unfortunately people as well. So she's already on fire. And then it just, that's really it. I mean, even at that, she probably still would have sunk, but they didn't rest there. After that, some Devastator torpedo bombers came in and walloped her, one of the few times the Devastators were effective. And really after 11:30, the order to abandon ship was given, and she quickly went under. She had taken at least, and it's kind of debated, but at least 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo hits. She was in a bad way, so she went under very quickly. Of her crew of nearly 800, 300 survived the initial sinking, but since U.S. forces were in the area, the Japanese destroyers could not rescue them until that afternoon, by which time only 203 were still in the water and were picked up. So unfortunately, nearly 100 perished through injuries or other privations. And yeah, that was it. That was her one real mission, at least combat mission. And she was the first Japanese carrier to be sunk. But this would just be a little taste of what would happen right at a month later at the Battle of Midway. And with that, yeah, America, for the first time, scratched one flat top. But her sister would actually have a much longer and more interesting career. Zuiho here has the same basic specs as her sister. And interestingly, she was actually laid down a little after. She wasn't laid down until June of 1935, and then was launched in 1936. And then the decision was taken while she was still being fitted out to make her into a carrier, and she was commissioned as a light carrier in 1940. And she would still really hang out around Japanese waters throughout 1941. Along with the carrier Shoho, she would actually be available in December of 1941 to support the Pearl Harbor attack strike force, especially as they were returning to Japan, kind of covering their withdrawal and monitoring for submarines, providing reconnaissance. After that, she too would be used as an aircraft ferry. She would take some modern A6M Zeros over to the Philippines in February of 1942. And then she would kind of operate around there for a little bit. So she would not leave Japanese waters again until after her sister ship had already been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June of 1942, she was assigned to support the main group during the invasion of Midway. That would be the main battleship group, not the carrier group. Lucky for her in a lot of ways. And she really didn't do much there. She was equipped with 6 modern A6M Zeros, 6 old A5M Clods, and 12 B5N Kate bombers. But all she really did on June 5th, so really after the horrific Battle of Midway, her cap did fight off a Allied reconnaissance aircraft and helped cover the retreat of the shattered Japanese forces. And then she would get back to Japanese waters, and then she would put in at Sasebo in July for a minor refit, which would last until August. Then she would be assigned to work with 2 of the remaining fleet carriers, and she would next be used during the Guadalcanal campaign in October. This would be when the Army was trying to retake Henderson Field. She would have her air group changed again to 18 A6M Zeros and just 6 B5N Kates because of different combat. And her most notable thing on October 26th, during the Battle of the San Cruz Islands, her air group met an air group from the USS Enterprise, really in mid-flight as they were both crossing paths to attack their respective carriers. And it's kind of an even Steven. Zuiho would lose 4 Zeros, but Enterprise would lose a total of 6 aircraft, 3 F4Fs, and 3 SBDs. Actually, were they SBDs or Avengers? I can't remember. Bombers. Let's just say naval bombers. You get the idea. While Zuiho would not really do any damage to Enterprise, her aircraft, Enterprise's bombers would deliver, I think they would be SBDs. Anyway, I distract myself. They would deliver 2 500-pound bombs to her, and unlike with Shoho and many other Japanese carriers, for once She did not burst into flames. Actually, while the bombs did put her flight deck out of operations, that's about all they did. The damage was pretty minimum, and she was able to withdraw to Truk and then back to Japan for repair work, which was completed by December 16th, 1942. And of course, at this point, Guadalcanal, a very hard-fought battle for Americans, had eventually turned in their favor. I don't want to make light of it. It was not an easy campaign, but Americans, especially Marines, eventually won out. But it came at a great cost. Times her aircraft contingent was temporarily transferred off and operated from land bases, shore bases, on different attacks and raids. And she would shuttle a few things around, but honestly, really not doing a whole lot. She would return to Japan and actually be assigned to work with the other light carriers, Chitose or Chitose here, and her sister ship, Chiyoda. So we had 3 light carriers working together. Originally they were going to have 21 Zeros and 9 torpedo bombers each, but then in February of 1944 it was decided to just have one combined air group, kind of a miniature version of how Japan had deployed their carriers in 1941 or 1942. They would transport a few things between the Philippines and Truk in the early part of the year. Then they would be assigned to the Philippines in May of 1944. They really could not do much because they were bottled in by American subs, and that would not be Zuiho's first encounter with subs. Actually, she tried to get back to Japan in November of 1943. Since Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, they tried to put subs in her path. And while they did torpedo 1 or 2 other Japanese ships, the USS Skate tried its best to torpedo her, but she got lucky. She made it. So again, she was kind of balled up, and that would lead to the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The idea was to use Zuiho and the other light carriers as a distraction. They were fully loaded up with 90 aircraft between them, plus other carriers around, and the cruisers, the heavy cruisers, had their own planes. You know how that battle went. They lost a bunch. They would actually discover the American task force first, but that didn't really help them out. They were originally going to target the American carriers during the retaking of the Philippines, but then they learned where the battleship task force was, and so they were diverted to attack the battleships. The problem is they launched pretty much all they could, keeping very few planes in reserve, and it was all for naught. Americans put up 199 of the new F-6F Hellcats and just slaughtered them. In fact, only one Japanese plane delivered 1 bomb. That was on the USS South Dakota. And while it injured 50 crewmen, it did very moderate, even minor damage to the superstructure and didn't even put the battleship out of action. They only shot down 3 Hellcats, and between the 3 light carriers, they only had 21 planes left out of the 90 they started with. And even amongst the entire Japanese air fleet that was there in the Philippine Sea, there's only about 34 planes left operational. So this really was what broke the air wing of the Japanese Navy. Anyway, they went back to Japan in July, August, another minor refit, and then she would sortie out again in October during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And again, they would initially get the jump on the Americans there. On the 24th of October, the Japanese carriers would send out a wave against the American task force. They used what they had, but frankly, by this point, they didn't have it near enough. The Japanese planes didn't even penetrate the American air defense, the fighter screen. They lost several planes. They retreated, having done no damage. And the idea, again, was for Zuiho and Chitose to be decoy. They were north. They wanted to lure the Americans north so that they could strip away the coverage for the landing force there, and then hopefully have other Japanese surface ships sneak in and attack the undefended transports. It didn't work out that way. Americans almost took the bait, but didn't, at least not so that it mattered. The Americans would find the carrier force late in that day. They decided not to pursue because dark was coming on. They did send some reconnaissance aircraft from the USS Independence to kind of shadow and keep track of the Japanese carrier force throughout the night of the 24th, 25th, planning a dawn attack the next day, and returning the favor of sending a wave at them. The engagement would happen shortly after 7:30 that morning, and whereas the the Japanese attack on American vessels was ineffective, the reverse was not true. Americans went at them with 60 Hellcats plus 130 mix of torpedo and dive bombers. The first wave hit the Zuiho and did some pretty decent damage, starting a lot of small fires, starting a little flooding, damaging the flight deck towards the rear where the torpedo hit, or the bomb hit, damaging the rear elevator, jamming the rudder. But believe it or not, for once, Japanese damage control worked. The ship was listing, they kind of got that under control, they got the flooding under control, they got steering back, and another lucky break for the ship. The second wave really ignored the Zuiho and went after the sister ship over here. They went after Chiyoda. So she got lucky for a bit. But then the third wave came shortly after lunchtime and had a couple of direct hits and several near misses that hit the ocean, sent a bunch of splinters into the sides and jammed up the propellers and started flooding again, so much so that a little before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she was dead in the water. And then the fourth wave of bombers came in and just finished her off. I mean, she was already pretty much going under. It was almost a death by 1,000 cuts, because while there's only a handful of direct hits, all the near misses, and there were a ton, the fragments and the splinters from these bombs and torpedoes just did a ton of little cracks and whatnot. And of course the initial bomb hit was patched up but not totally repaired. So the order was given to abandon ship shortly after 3, and she would go under by around 3:30. I'm not actually sure how many people survived, because the numbers don't make sense. You can look it up for yourself. It's actually hard to find info on these light carriers. Everyone focuses on the fleet carriers. But yeah, she went to the bottom. To be honest, they didn't expect the decoy carriers to survive. They pretty much knew it was a one-way mission. The sad thing for her crew was that first bomb hit was a lucky hit for the Americans. The cap was very light. They only had about 13 A-6Ms to defend themselves, and of course, only a handful of those were in the air. They were preparing to launch their reserve fighters when the bomb hit happened, meaning her flight deck was put out of commission, so even what minor defense she might have been able to muster was knocked out early on, meaning she was basically just a sitting duck that day. And again, that was the same battle that her fellow light cruiser here was in. So, yeah. Well, Chitose had a little bit different career trajectory than the two Zuiho classes. She too was laid down towards the end of 1934 and was designed as a seaplane tender. She would be launched in 1936 and commissioned in 1938 as just that. She would actually be used as a seaplane tender. She would carry 24 float planes, and she would be used in auxiliary roles during the Battle of Midway. She would also be used here and there to support other operations, mostly as a reconnaissance vessel. But of course, after the losses at Midway, Japan needed all the carriers she could get, even light ones. And Choso actually was built. Choso was actually built to be converted to a light carrier if needed. So work began either in late 1942 or early 1943, depending on your source, and would commence throughout that entire year. She was recommissioned into the Navy towards the end of 1943 as a light carrier, and then would start to serve in that capacity at the beginning of 1944. She would miss out on the Battle of the Philippine Sea, at least in a direct role. She would pretty much get away unscathed there, which is more than they could say for some. She was used as a distraction decoy, just like her sister ship and Zuiho. But she too would meet her end at Leyte Gulf on October 25th. Now, spec-wise, she is very similar to the first two we've talked about. She too carries 30 aircraft, has 2 elevators, no catapults. She's actually a little bit shorter at about 630 feet, but also a little bit wider at about 68 feet. She had a slightly larger crew of around 800, give or take. And she was slightly faster at just under 29 knots. Well, at Leyte Gulf, again, she was used as a decoy. And that was pretty much it. She was torpedoed by aircraft from the USS Essex, and she sunk. I mean, there's not really much else to put it. I mean, it's the same old story, really, at this point. Her sister, Chiyoda, was actually sunk with a combination of bombs and some shell fire from battleships, and even a couple of torpedoes shot by destroyers. But both were lost that day, along with the Zuiho. So, yeah. More carriers at the bottom. At this point, Japan is getting pretty thin on aircraft carriers, light or otherwise. Funnily enough, Hosho is still in operation, as I said in its video. Of course, it wasn't ever a frontline vessel, so had a lot to do with it, but yep. I just think these conversions are quite interesting, and definitely making do with what they had. And again, everyone talks about the fleet carriers, but I think it's interesting to talk about the lesser known ships too. Hopefully you do as well. As I've said in the other videos, these are 1,100 scale models from Eaglemoss and their Warships collection. The reason the collection is so Japanese heavy is because it was exclusively released in Japan. Just some of them have made it over to America. The two carriers here I know are very similar looking, and normally I wouldn't buy two of the same class, but I like aircraft carriers, so I'm going to pretty much pick up any carrier I can get regardless. It was actually a bit of an adventure to get the Chitose here. She sold out right as I was going to order her from Aikens, but luckily Flying Mule had some left. But there you have it. That's the Japanese carriers that I've got so far. I don't have any other large fleet carriers. They're very hard to find. But if I find them, I will definitely do a video there as well. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon. Next time.